Imagine trying to navigate a sprawling, wildly complex continent, but the only map you have hasn't been updated in nearly a century. Sounds impossible, right? Well, that's exactly the staggering paradox we're looking at today. The world's largest democracy has been crafting its most absolutely crucial social justice policies and distributing life-changing resources completely blindfolded. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack a structural crisis that affects hundreds of millions of people, India's caste census data desert.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with India's data desert, move into the legal battle for data, discuss elite capture, zoom in on intersectional exclusion, and finally unpack the political economy of silence.
All right, Section 1. India's data desert, operating in the dark.
94. Think about that number for a second. It has been 94 years since the 1931 British colonial census, which, believe it or not, remains the very last time India comprehensively collected and published caste data. Now, since independence, the Indian state has meticulously tracked demographic data on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, but they have completely neglected the reliable enumeration of other backward classes, or OBCs. And when you realize that OBCs are estimated to make up over 50% of the Indian population, you really start to see the scale of this problem. We are literally talking about a modern state designing massive affirmative action interventions based on century-old guesswork.
When we actually visualize this massive gap for other backward classes, it's honestly staggering. Over half the population is statistically invisible in contemporary national data. As policy experts point out in our source material, designing policies without this data means India is effectively flying blind while claiming to pursue social justice. Because at the end of the day, you simply cannot fix an inequality that you refuse to measure.
So how did we actually get here? Well, back when the 1951 census excluded caste tables, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect of the Indian Constitution, called it an act of petty intelligence. He warned that data visibility is foundational to meaningful inclusion. Fast forward to 2011, the government finally attempted a socioeconomic and caste census, the SCCC. But it was an open-ended survey that resulted in over 46 lakh distinct caste names and a mind-boggling 8 crore data errors. That's 80 million errors. The Supreme Court called it flawed and bound to mislead, rendering the whole thing completely unusable. And that brings us to 2025, a really critical turning point where India has announced a shift in policy to finally enumerate caste.
Let's move on to Section 2, the legal battle for data, the catch-22 of quotas. Okay, so to really grasp this, we need to talk about this specific legal phrase, quantifiable data. You see, affirmative action in India isn't just about good intentions, it operates within a very strict legal framework. The Supreme Court has consistently ruled that caste is a valid proxy for identifying backwardness. But, and this is a massive but, to uphold any reservation policy, especially when it comes to promotions, the courts demand hard, granular, contemporary, quantifiable data. They need empirical proof that a specific class is inadequately represented in public services and that helping them won't affect administrative efficiency.
In fact, the Supreme Court actually calls this quantifiable data a sine qua non, which is basically just a fancy legal way of saying it is an absolutely indispensable condition. And this creates a brutal catch-22 that plays out over and over again, from the Indrasani case capping quotas at 50% due to a lack of data, to the striking down of the Maratha reservation law, to the Uttarakhand PWD case regarding promotions. The courts continually strike down or limit affirmative action policies for one simple reason: the state refuses to collect the very data the courts explicitly require. It's a bureaucratic doom loop that completely stalls social justice.
Which brings us to Section 3, elite capture and unequal quotas, a system skewed. When you dive into state-level data, like the 2023 Bihar survey, you see this massive overrepresentation just flourishing in the dark. Get this. Forward castes make up just 15.5% of the population, yet they occupy a highly disproportionate 75% of government jobs. Take kayastas, for example. They constitute a tiny 0.6% of the population but hold 6.7% of the posts. That is an 11-to-1 overrepresentation ratio. Without comprehensive data, a very small elite essentially monopolizes access to the state apparatus. But here's the thing. This inequality isn't just an upper versus lower caste issue. It happens entirely within marginalized groups, too. The findings from the Justice G. Rohini Commission are honestly shocking. They found that 97% of OBC reservation benefits are flowing to just 25% of castes, And even worse, 983 backward caste groups, which is about 37% of all OBC groups, receive absolutely zero representation. None, because the system relies on these blanket quotas without granular subcategorization. A few dominant backward castes with stronger political capital absorb all the benefits. That leaves hundreds of smaller rural communities completely locked out. For them, affirmative action is nothing more than symbolic.
Now for Section 4, Intersectional Exclusion and Erasure, the Invisible Millions.
10.7 crore. To put that into perspective, that is over 100 million people. That's the estimated population of denotified, nomadic, and semi-nomadic tribes, or DNTs, in India. These are communities that were historically and brutally branded as born criminals by British colonial authorities under the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. Today, they represent what is perhaps the largest stateless population within a democratic nation. Because they're highly mobile and the welfare system is built strictly for sedentary people, a vast majority are entirely off official lists. They're denied caste certificates, voter IDs, ration cards, the whole shebang. Their exclusion isn't just some administrative oversight, it's a direct continuation of colonial-era erasure. Justice for these 10.7 crore people literally begins with simply being counted.
And this sweeping data gap completely misses the reality of intersectionality. Caste doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? It compounds with gender and identity to create what scholars call triple marginalization. Dalit women, for example, endure systemic caste, gender, and economic exclusion all at once. The National Crime Records Bureau notes that 10 Dalit women and girls are raped every single day in India, and tragically, that number is likely heavily underreported. Similarly, Dalit transgender persons face compounding marginalization, battling what activists term cis-Brahmanical patriarchy. Yet, because our national data frameworks are so rigid and outdated, these deeply compounding injustices remain legally and statistically invisible.
Even within the scheduled caste umbrella itself, the disparities are wild. Contrast the dominant, highly visible groups against the community like the Musahars. Traditionally forced into roles like rat-catching, they are one of the most oppressed Dalit subgroups. In Bihar, they make up 3% of the population, yet they hold only 0.26% of government jobs. That's a tiny fraction of a single percent. An effective census absolutely has to subcategorize to recognize these specific realities. Otherwise, the most marginalized will just remain buried underneath the very data that was meant to liberate them.
Finally, Section 5, the political economy of silence. Why hide the truth?
Our sources highlight something that might actually surprise you. This is not a partisan issue. There is a deep, cross-party consensus when it comes to suppressing caste data. The Congress, the BJP, and left parties have all historically withheld survey results. According to Dalit Bahujan activists cited in our source material, all major political formations have trotted out the exact same excuse over the years, quote, poor data quality, to kill the release of caste data. This uniform silence strongly suggests that keeping the data hidden serves a shared institutional interest.
So, what's really going on? Well, the refusal to count caste is widely analyzed as a deliberate political strategy of invisibilization. By claiming to be caste blind, the system effectively protects the existing upper caste monopoly in both public bureaucracy and the private sector. It hides this new division of power, where dominant castes migrate to an unchecked private sector while marginalized groups are left fighting over a shrinking public sector. Plus, a lack of data allows for administrative workarounds, like lateral entry into senior government roles, which bypass affirmative action quotas entirely. Ultimately, the data is suppressed because hard evidence of extreme inequality is a huge threat to those who currently hold structural power.
As India approaches its highly anticipated next census, the nation is truly standing at a crossroads. Will it acknowledge that blanket reservations without subcategorization have left millions behind? Will it finally map out the denotified tribes and intersectional minorities? The choice is stark: continue to engineer social policy in the dark, or finally embrace the data required to forge a truly just republic.
We'll leave you with this foundational warning from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. A nation cannot be built by turning a blind eye to the reality of its foundations. True constitutional justice demands visibility. Without the courage to measure the inequality it claims to fight, India is trying to solve a huge problem it basically refuses to see. What do you think? Is data the first necessary step to dismantling these entrenched hierarchies? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the data or, the lack thereof around you.